Assimilation is the process in which members of an ethnic community lose their cultural characteristics that distinguish them from the dominant cultural group. Full assimilation happens when the members that immigrate to the other country are indistinguishable from the other group. There are different kinds of assimilation. When we talk about color assimilation, it refers to the mixture of colors. For example, when you mix small amount of red in a larger amount of color blue, the red will be assimilated into the larger mix. When we talk about cultural assimilation, we refer to the influence two cultures or groups of people have on each other.
Assimilation can be forced or spontaneous. When it's forced, people from the dominant culture will oppress people from the other culture to change their traditions, language, and identity to their culture. When it's spontaneous, people change their culture unconsciously because they see the majority of people celebrating specific traditions and talking in a determined language. So, because of social pressure, they see themselves change to this new culture.
We can say that assimilation is the process where a person or group mixes with a stronger culture, losing characteristics from their own identity. This process can happen in two ways: by forcing the person or by unconsciousness of the situation. The stronger group can influence or force the minor cultural to adapt to their traditions and beliefs. The other way is that the minor cultural group, by the time starts to get used to their beliefs and traditions.
There are multiple examples of assimilation that have happened throughout history. For example, the Native Americans were educated with European culture. Indians were forbidden from practicing their culture and their rituals as they were forced to attend public school and church and gave up their lands. When immigrants from Poland and Italy came to the US, they weren't received well. They were considered racially and culturally inferior by the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant group and had trouble integrating. These immigrants had to sacrifice their roots to be accepted in society and to be more like their peers.
That would be the case of a forced assimilation, because German Jews didn't have any option rather than moving from their original country to another culture. For example, if an Italian family migrates to Canada to live, they're very prone to start speaking English and celebrating Canadian traditions rather than speaking Italian and celebrating Italian traditions. Another example of forced assimilation was in 121 BC, when the Roman Empire conquered the Gaul Celtics, who lived in what today is France. They imposed their Roman traditions, clothing, and language to the Gaul Celtics.
These are some examples of assimilation in history. These situations show how the stronger cultural group have a major influence on minor group. The minor group is either forced to adapt to the bigger society or slowly they become part of them. Because of these bigger groups making societies adapt to them is how mixes of cultures occur around the world. The Native Americans were influenced by European people, causing these two cultures to mix or to one control the other. This is the reason why we all are multicultural.
The melting pot theory refers to the conjunction of cultures. When you are in a melting pot, you tend to lose your original culture and traditions. People from various countries and indeed cultures come to a country and they contribute different aspects from their culture in order to create a new and unique one. And the result of this is that the contributions of the cultures are indistinguishable from one another and are effectively melted together.
Ralph Emerson was the first person to use this term. He said, "The fusing process transforms the English, the German, the Irish immigrant into an American." The individuality of the immigrant, almost even his traits of race and religion, fuse down in the democratic alembic, like chips of brass thrown into the melting pot. He is comparing how such different cultures that live in the same country fuse their identities to create a new one, the one that everyone can identify with. The melting pot theory bases in the assimilation process where immigrants lose their unique traits of identity and start practicing the dominant cultural aspects.
The melting pot is a process where people that are part of many cultures come together to a mix and allow to everyone share the same values, beliefs, and traditions in the same place. The melting pot is something that has occurred in all around the world, making societies multicultural, becoming as only one culture.
The South Pole theory says that there is times when the new immigrants don't lose their unique aspects of their culture. have, like in the melting pot theory. Instead, they retain them. The different unique characteristics of each culture are still recognizable within the larger society. That's where the name comes from. Since the cultures are still recognizable, we can relate that when we look into a salad and we are able to recognize each ingredient, and they all make and conform the salad bowl, or in other cases, the entire society.
When the salad bowl happens, people from different cultures are living together and practicing their own traditions. It is a very positive theory because while sharing the same country, people can still practice their own culture without the pressure to change and practice another one in order to be accepted by society. It helps conserve identity.
The salad bowl theory talks about how different cultures come together in the same place, but they maintain their main aspects of their own culture. These people maintain their culture as a way to continue with their identity. This is also a case around the globe where in some countries many cultures together are separated from others so they can preserve their identities.
Jews in Germany had several rights before the rise of the Nazi regime. They participated in cultural, economic, and political German life. They had the right to education, they had the right to have a citizenship, the right to practice their own religion, the right to vote, the right to speak their own language, the right to civil protection, the right to use public areas, and as we see the rights Jews had in Germany, and if we compare them to other rights Jews had in other European countries, we can tell that there were certain differences.
For example, in Great Britain, Jews were not allowed to immigrate. In Ukraine, they didn't have the right to live. Pogroms were performed, and they didn't have the right to have civil protection. This happened in Poland as well in 1917. In France, they had the right to immigrate and have a French citizenship. In Poland, Jewish people were not allowed to be doctors. They weren't allowed to be lawyers because licenses to practice laws were not given to them. In 1918, Polish Jews were not allowed to work on crops or in large cities. In consequence, they were excluded from society and were obligated to live in little towns outside the city called shtetls.
Jews' rights in history changed depending on the place where they stayed on. The rights applied to them were simple: to have a place to live, to be protected by the law, to have importance as anyone else, but in some places these basic rights were inexistent. Jews were treated in some places as part of their society, sharing the same rights as the person who lived there all his life, but in other locations they were not allowed to do basic things as the main human rights.
Jewish people that lived in the city and in the countryside had different types of lives. People that lived in the city were well educated and lived in good conditions. Some of them didn't practice their Jewish traditions like people that lived in the country, away from the privileges the Jews in the city has. They had clothes of good quality and they dressed as their fellow German companions. The Jews that lived in the countryside were engaged in commerce and in middleman occupations. These businesses were small and they couldn't provide big outcomes in the countryside. Most of the Jews earned their money from farming, while others earned their livelihood by owning resale shops, selling tools, clothes, household utensils, food, and agricultural products. They didn't have big houses or villas like the Jews that lived in the city. Instead, they lived close to their businesses and their animals, and children had to work hard and got many responsibilities to carry on.
As well, Jewish people living in the city were more educated academically, and the vast majority didn't practice the Jewish life traditions like the Jewish people living in the countryside did. That is why Germans treated them with more respect and they were not often discriminated. Jewish people living in the countryside lived in little neighborhoods called shtetls. They had a Jewish life. They went to Yiddish theaters, they talked Yiddish, and dressed with the traditional Jew clothing, the quiche, streimel, and payot, and women will use wigs and kerchiefs. German people will point them discrimination every time they saw a Jewish person. It wasn't common that Jewish people living in the shtetls outside the city come to the city, so Germans saw them more like foreign citizens, and since Germans were very nationalists, they almost saw them as invaders.
These two different styles of life that the Jews had marked an important opinion on the society, and how to treat one and the other. The society of Jews who live in the countryside were seen as people who don't deserve the same treat as someone who live in the city, just because of their beliefs and traditions, which they were not afraid to show. On the other side, there were the Jews who live in the city and had the same treatment as others. They were considered more valuable than the society who live on the countryside. The discrimination that occurred happened because of one group of Jews who adopted and acted like the major culture and the ones who stayed with their identity against any opinion.
Non-assimilated Jews were treated differently than assimilated Jews. They weren't part or considered part of society because they didn't identify as Germans. They were treated as strangers due to their persistency of being recognized just as Jews. On the other hand, assimilated Jews were indeed considered part of German society. They dressed and literally lived as Germans, making them fit in. They didn't help non-assimilated Jews because if they did, they would have been treated just as them.
Assimilated Jews talk German, dress like Germans, and live like Germans. That is why society accepted more than non-assimilated Jews. For Germans, very nationalists back then, non-assimilated Jews were like strangers, were almost people who didn't have to be in Germany, because they didn't identify themselves as Germans but as Jews. This says that society back then didn't accept other people's cultural differences, and if they weren't exactly like them, they would judge and discriminate these different people.
Assimilated and non-assimilated Jews. These were two groups, one that changed and adapted to the society, leaving behind any cultural identity they used to have, mixing with the stronger culture. The other group being people who wanted to maintain their beliefs and show everyone that they were not ashamed of who they really are. The assimilated Jews were the ones who adapted to German traditions and were treated as one of them, as a German. The Jews who were not assimilated were seen as foreigners and discriminated because they didn't belong as part of the society.
Inquiry question. An individual's identity and the way they are treated depends on their location and era.
I think that the identity each person has does depend on the location and era they were part of, because the situations they have experienced are based on the place and the problems they have faced with their other members of the community. The treatment you receive also depends on the location, and that makes every person who they are. For example, the Jews in Germany had a different treatment than the Jews in other countries in Europe. It also affected the year in which the Jews were in each country. In Germany, before World War II, Jews had a decent treatment and were considered part of society. But as years went by and World War II began, they were mistreated and abused. This changes in the way the Jews were treated depending on the year they were living in Germany and the fact that they were living there and not in other countries.
I agree with you, Macarena, because all countries have different ideologies, so people will be treated differently depending on what the people in the country think or how they see the world. The era or time is also important because before the Showa, 1920s to 1930s, society in general was really close-minded, and some countries like Germany were extremely nationalists and wouldn't accept anybody from other country or culture into their nation. Countries like Ukraine and Russia were performing various pogroms. The First World War ended recently and the Second World War was coming soon. Now in 2015-2016, society is a lot more open-minded and homecoming than before. As well, with globalization and intellectual development, we have learned that no matter what skin color, religion, culture, ethnicity, or sexual orientation a person or a group of individuals have, we all have to treat each other with respect.
Identity plays a big role on how society treats people. In 2016, people are more comprehensive on how to treat someone who maybe has a different mindset as them or just by looking different. This acceptance society has over many cultures is reasonable new. In the past, people used to discriminate others just because of their religion, customs, skin color, all of these factors that now we see as something common. We don't see the need to discriminate others because of these characteristics. As Macarena and Anita said, in the past cultures were discriminated at certain events like World War I or the World War II. I think that identity and the way people treat others don't necessarily depends on the location and era, but on big events that change people's perspective of others. As Macarena said before, World War II, Jews who live in Germany were treated with respect. Germans considered them part of their society. When the war came, a person changed everyone's opinion on how to see Jews. People follow this ideology, leaving behind the good moments in the past they might have with these people. This is a good example because we can appreciate that an event as powerful that is a world war can change the view of how people should be treated.
Debatable question. Can all members of society be treated completely equally if they don't share the same identity?
I think that members in a society will never be treated equally if they have different identities. When someone has an identity, this consists of the things that make the person, his or her beliefs, decisions, experiences, etc. Identities are completely different for every person, since every human being has a different mind and experiences things differently. If a community has people that believe different things and people that make things differently, they will never agree on anything. They will always be fighting and trying to be on top of each other, making the treatment each receives differently. The only way in which the treatment that people receive will be equal is if they assimilate and create an identity that is equal for everyone. And that way, everyone will have the same point of view and beliefs.
I think that all members of society can and should be treated equally, even if they don't share the same identity. I agree with what Macarena said, that people from different cultures can fight because of their differences. But it's also true that we are developed enough in order to overcome our cultural differences and don't discriminate each other. Just like in the salad bowl theory, where people from various ethnic origins live together in the same territory. It is possible to live in harmony, because when someone moves to another country, they're not going to keep 100% of their original identity, because they have to talk another language, celebrate other traditions, but they will still practice their culture. If a full assimilation doesn't happen, people from different cultures will have their own identity, but yet they will share something with the dominant culture. And if any assimilation occurs, people deserve the same respect because they are all citizens and part of the country. And it is possible to overcome cultural differences and treat everyone equally, giving the same respect, opportunities, rights. It is possible to live in a harmonious salad bowl society.
People's judgment of treatment of others can be influenced or conditioned by many factors. These reasons why people treat others the way they do can be because of how they were educated, the social group that influenced them, etc. Every person is different and has different criteria of situations around them. This is why members of society never will be treated equally. People can tolerate things they may not like, but will never give a good treatment if they don't want to.